On the night of September 11th, Michael Morrell flies back to Washington with the president on Air Force One. On final descent, a military aide motions to a stunning sight: an F-16 fighter jet alongside the plane's left wing.
The F-16 was so close, you could see the pilot looking at us. And in the distance, you could see the still burning Pentagon. Then he said something to me that, to this day, sends shivers up my back. He said their mission is if somebody fires a surface-to-air missile at us on final approach, their mission is to put themselves between that missile and the President of the United States. That was surreal.
9:05 a.m. on September 11, 2001, counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke is driving up to a gate outside the White House when an aide calls him and tells him the other tower is hit. Clarke responds, "Well, now we know who we're dealing with. I want the highest level person in Washington from each agency on screen now, especially the FAA." He has already ordered this aide to set up a secure video conference about 5 minutes earlier. A few minutes later, he finds Vice President Cheney and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice in Cheney's White House office. Cheney tells Clarke it's an al-Qaeda attack, and they like simultaneous attacks. This may not be over. Rice asks Clarke for recommendations, and he says, "We're putting together a secure teleconference to manage the crisis." He also recommends evacuating the White House. However, evacuation does not begin until 40 minutes later. Rice notes that the Secret Service wants them to go to the bomb shelter below the White House. And as Clarke leaves the other two, he sees Rice and Cheney gathering papers and preparing to evacuate. Vice President Cheney goes from his White House office to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, or PEOC, a bunker in the east wing of the White House. At about this time, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, after initiating a video conference with Richard Clarke in the West Wing, goes to the PEOC to be with Cheney. There is no video link between response centers in the East and West, but a secure telephone line is used instead. One eyewitness account, David Borer, a White House photographer, says Cheney leaves for the PEOC just after 9 a.m. However, there is a second account claiming that Cheney doesn't leave until sometime after 9:30. In this account, Secret Service agents burst into Cheney's White House office. They carry him under his arms, nearly lifting him off the ground, and propel him down the steps into the White House basement and through a long tunnel toward an underground bunker. At about the same time, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice is told to go to the bunker as well. In addition to the eyewitness accounts of Clarke and Borer, ABC News claims that Cheney is in the bunker when he is told that Flight 77 is 50 miles away from the Washington at 9:27, suggesting that accounts of Cheney entering the bunker at 9:27 are likely incorrect. President George Bush works his staff to prepare a speech he will deliver at 9:29 a.m. He intermittently watches the television coverage in the room next to the schoolroom at Florida. He speaks on the phone to advisors, first calling National Security Advisor Rice, then Vice President Cheney, then New York Governor George Pataki. Bush often turns to look at the television screen where he declares, "We're at war." Bush later claims he makes no major decisions about the crisis until after boarding Air Force One at 9:55 a.m. At 9:20 a.m., Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta arrives at the White House bunker containing Vice President Cheney and others. In later testimony, he recalls that Cheney is already there when he arrives. This supports accounts of Cheney reaching the bunker not long after the second World Trade Center crash, but the 9/11 Commission concludes Cheney doesn't arrive until a few minutes after 10 a.m. Cheney and Rice, in their bunker below the White House, are told by an aide that an airplane is headed toward Washington from 50 miles away. The aide is Navy officer David Cochran. The plane is American Airlines Flight 77. FAA Deputy Monty Belger says, well, we're watching this target on the radar, but the transponder's been turned off, so we have no identification. They are given further notices when the plane is 30 miles away, and then 20, and then 10. When the plane was basically 10 miles out, Naval Aide Cochran tells Cheney, do the orders still stand? Cheney quickly whips his neck and says, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta gives literally the same account before the 9/11 Commission. However, the 9/11 Commission later claims that the plane heading toward Washington is only discovered at 9:32 a.m. Captain Charles Ledig is in command of the National Military Command Center, the military's worldwide nerve center. Telephone links are established within the MCC, located inside the Pentagon, but on the opposite side of the building where the explosion will happen. Canada's equivalent command center, Strategic Command, theater commanders, and federal emergency response agencies. An air threat conference call is then initiated, and it lasts for 8 hours. At one time or another, President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, and key military officers and leaders of the FAA NORAD, including the White House and Air Force One, are heard on the open line, but at no point during the conversation are they all together speaking at the same time. NORAD Commander Director Captain Michael Jelnick claims this happens immediately after the second World Trade Center hit. However, the 9/11 Commission concludes it starts nearly 30 minutes later at approximately 9:29 a.m. Brigadier General Montague Winfield, who later takes over for Ledig, says all of the governmental agencies that were involved in any activity going on in the United States at that point were in that conference at some time or another. The call continues right through the Pentagon explosion. The impact is not felt within the NMCC. However, despite being in the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld doesn't enter the MCC or participates in the call until 10:30 a.m., well after all the planes are downed. As President Bush begins a speech in Florida, Richard Clarke orders all U.S. embassies overseas closed and orders all military bases to be on high alert. Combat ThreatCon. Over the next few minutes, Clarke discusses with aides where Bush should go from Sarasota, Florida. He telephones the PIOC, the command bunker, where Cheney and Rice claim that somebody has to tell the president he can't come back to Washington. Cheney and Condoleezza Rice Security Service concur altogether that they do not want Bush to return, for Washington was considered a threat for an attack. Second, when they take off, they should have fighter escorts. 3, we need to authorize the Air Force to shoot down any aircraft, including a hijacker passenger flight that looks like it is threatening to attack and cause large-scale death on the ground. This information was not relayed to the president. However, when Bush departs on Air Force One about a half hour later, there are no fighter escorts, and none appear for an hour or so. In addition, if Clarke requests authorization for a shoot down at this time, it is apparently ignored because Clarke is not part of the military chain of command. Neither President Bush nor Vice President Cheney give shoot down authorization for at least another 30 minutes. The chain of command in which the President of the United States is, according to the Constitution, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces and Chief Executive of the federal government. The second in command is the Secretary of Defense, who is the principal assistant to the President in all matters relating to the Department of Defense, and is vested with statutory authority to lead the department and all of its component agencies, including military command authority, second only to the President. In third of command is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Not part of the military chain of command is the Vice President of the United States. At 9:32 a.m., according to the 9/11 Commission, the Dulles Airport Terminal Control Facility in Washington has been looking for unidentified primary radar blips since 9:21 a.m. And now they find one. Several Dulles flight controllers observed the primary radar tracking eastbound at a high rate of speed and notify Reagan Airport. FAA personnel at both Reagan and Dulles airports notified the Secret Service. The identity or aircraft type is unknown. However, this is American Airlines Flight 77. However, other accounts placed the discovery of this plane by Dulles at around 9:24 a.m. And Vice President Cheney is told radar is tracking Flight 77 at 9:27 a.m. Having learned that the Pentagon had been hit, Vice President Cheney telephones President Bush, who is on his way to the Sarasota airport, and tells him that the White House has been targeted. Bush says he wants to return to Washington, but Cheney advises him not to until we can find out what the hell is going on. According to Newsweek, this call takes place in a tunnel on the way to the Piak underground bunker, and Cheney reaches the bunker shortly before 10 a.m. The 9/11 Commission's account largely follows Newsweek's. Cheney reaches the tunnel around the same time of the Pentagon crash and lingers by a secured telephone as he talks to Bush. The commission has Cheney enter the bunker just before 10 a.m., but they note there was conflicting evidence as to when the vice president arrived in the shelter conference room. Indeed, in other accounts, including those of Richard Clarke and Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta, Cheney reaches the bunker before Flight 77 crashes at 9:37 a.m. Regardless of Cheney's location, as Cheney and Bush talk on the phone, Bush once again refrains from making any decisions or orders about the crisis. At some point after the White House is evacuated, counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke institutes continuity of government plans. Important government personnel, especially those in line to succeed the president, are evacuated to alternate command centers. Additionally, Clarke gets a phone call from the Piak, where Vice President Cheney and National Security Advisor Rice are positioned. An aide tells Clarke that Air Force One is getting ready to take off with some press still on board. President Bush will divert to an airbase and fighter escort is authorized. And tell the Pentagon they have authority from the president to shoot down hostile aircraft. Repeat, they have authority to shoot down hostile aircraft. However, Acting Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Richard Myers wants the rules of engagement clarified before the shoot down order is passed on. So Clarke orders that pilots be given guidelines before receiving shoot down authorization. Clarke has no authority to shoot down aircraft, for he is not part of the military chain of command. Clarke's account that Cheney is giving shoot down authorization well before 10 a.m. matches Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta's account of seeing Cheney given what he interprets as a shoot down order before the Pentagon crash. Again, as Vice President, Cheney has no authorization to command the military chain of command. Clarke's account is taken noted. However, the 9/11 Commission later asserts that Cheney doesn't make the shoot down decision until about 10 a.m. According to 9/11 Commission, Lynn Cheney joins her husband, Vice President Cheney, in the Piak bunker below the White House. She had been at a sit-down office around 9 a.m. when she was escorted by the Secret Service to the White House. Richard Clarke describes the people in the Piak as decidedly more political than those in his bunker below the other wing of the White House. In addition to Cheney and his wife, most of the day, the Piak contains National Security Advisor Rice, Political Advisor Mary Madeline, Cheney's Chief of Staff Louis Scooter Libby, Deputy White House Chief of Staff John Bolton, and White House Communication Director Karen Hughes. Clarke is told later in the day by someone else in the Piak, "I can't hear the crisis conference led by Clarke because Miss Cheney keeps turning down the volume on you so she can hear CNN. And the vice president keeps hanging up the open line to you." Clarke notes that the right-wing ideologue Lynn Cheney frequently offers her advice and opinions during the crisis. After 9:56 a.m., Air Force One holding President Bush, where Bush talks on the phone to Vice President Cheney, and Cheney recommends that Bush authorize the military shoot down any plane under control of the hijackers. Bush later recalls, "You bet. We had a little discussion and not much else." The 9/11 Commission claims that Cheney tells Bush 3 planes are still missing and 1 has hit the Pentagon. Bush later says that he doesn't make any major decisions about how to respond to the 9/11 attacks until after Air Force One takes off, which fits with the account of Bush approving shoot-down authorization shortly after takeoff. Air Force One takes off quickly and gains altitude. One passenger on board the plane later says it was like a rocket. For a good 10 minutes, the plane was going almost straight up. Once the plane reaches cruising altitude, it flies in circles. Journalists on board sense this because the television reception for a local station generally remains good. Apparently, Bush, Cheney, and the Secret Service argue over the safety of Bush coming back to Washington. For much of the day, Bush is plagued by connectivity problems in trying to call Cheney and others. He is forced to use an ordinary cell phone instead of a secure phone, which keeps hanging up. According to a 9/11 Commission staff report, Vice President Cheney is told that a combat air patrol has been established over Washington. Cheney then calls President Bush to discuss the rules of engagement for the pilots. At 10:31 a.m., Bush authorizes the shoot-down of hijacked aircraft at this time. According to a Washington Post article, which places the call after 10 a.m., Cheney recommends that Bush authorize the military to shoot down any such civilian airliners, as momentous a decision as the president was asked to make in those first hours. Bush then talks to Defense Secretary Rumsfeld to clarify the procedure, and Rumsfeld passes word down the chain of command. Cheney and Bush recall having this phone call, and National Security Advisor Rice recalls overhearing it. However, as the commission notes, among the sources that reflect other important events that morning, there is no documentary evidence for this call. Although the relevant sources are incomplete, others nearby who were taking notes, such as the Vice President Chief of Staff, Louis Scooter Libby, who sat next to him and Lynn Cheney, did not note a call between the president and vice president immediately after the vice president entered the conference room. The commission also apparently concludes that no evidence exists to support the claim that Bush and Rumsfeld talked about such procedures with Vice President Cheney at this time. Commissioner Chairman Thomas Keene later says the phone logs don't exist because they evidently got so fouled up in the communications that the phone logs have nothing. So that's the evidence we have. Commission Vice Chairman Lee Hamilton says of the shoot-down order, "Well, I'm not sure it was carried out or even given authorization." Newsweek reports that it has learned that some on the commission staff were, in fact, highly skeptical of the vice president's account and made their views clearer in an earlier draft of their staff report. According to one knowledgeable source, some staffers flat out didn't believe the call ever took place. According to a 9/11 Commission staffer, the report was watered down after vigorous lobbying from the White House. An account by Canadian Captain Mike Jelenic, who was overseeing NORAD's Colorado headquarters, where he claims to hear Bush give a shoot-down order, as well as the order to empty the skies of the aircraft, appears to be discredited, meaning that the military chain of command was broken. The vice president had given no shoot-down authority for the hijacked planes until well after 10:30 a.m., hereby absconding and violating the national command, violating the law of the Constitution.